Bonsoir.
Good evening.
No, you don't need to I don't think you need to translate for that part. Bonsoir à tous. Donc, bienvenue à la conférence sur l'évolution, la Bible, la création. Donc, l'Église d'Étoiles du Matin est content de vous accueillir et d'accueillir aussi Goss. Il comprend le français, donc je peux parler en français avant de lui passer le micro. Je vous invite on va juste baisser la tête, on va prier pour remettre tous entre les mains du Seigneur. Et après ça, je vous expliquerai comment ça va se passer. Donc, Père, nous te bénissons, nous te rendons grâce. La Bible dit que tu as créé toutes choses. Et quand tu as créé avec des lois, tu as créé avec ce que nous voyons aujourd'hui. Aide-nous à mieux comprendre, aide-nous à mieux saisir. Nous prions, Seigneur, que tu nous conduises encore ce soir, que tu conduises notre orateur, que tu nous aides encore, Seigneur, à apprendre. Je te bénis, Seigneur, et que tout enjeu qui fut posé, Seigneur, soit mis de côté et que ta gloire encore change nos vies. Nous te rendons grâce dans le nom de Jésus. Amen. Donc, quelques instructions. Là, on essaye pour la première fois. L'orateur parle uniquement anglais. D'accord? D'habitude, on fait de la traduction simultanée, mais ça rajoute du temps. Donc, on essaye ce soir de la traduction en live, en direct avec l'AI. Donc, ceux qui ne sont pas à l'aise avec l'anglais, sentez-vous à l'aise. On aura des gens techniques à l'arrière pour vous aider à vous connecter sur un QR code. Si vous êtes juste fonctionnel anglais, je vous suggère quand même de vous connecter parce qu'on peut avoir la transcription de ce qu'il dit sur son téléphone. Donc, peut-être j'ai manqué un mot. En suivant, ça va me permettre de savoir qu'est-ce qu'il a dit, même si je suis à l'aise. Parce que ça peut être des fois des termes plus techniques qui ne sont pas des termes qu'on utilise tous les jours en anglais. D'accord? À la fin, il y a du matériel à vendre, il y a du matériel à discuter avec CMI. Donc, on aura une table de livres et de matériel. On aura aussi une offrande qu'on prendra de manière volontaire pour aider à couvrir les coûts de la conférence. Il y aura une période à la fin de questions-réponses. Donc, vous avez le droit de poser des questions à la fin. Et on va se retrouver dans un mois. Ce sera juste une séance de questions. Et on vous dira comment soumettre vos questions d'avance pour que l'orateur puisse se préparer. So, having said all this, and you said yes to everything I said.
Absolutely. Yes.
It's your turn to speak, and I'm going to be on the technical department.
Yes. Well, it's wonderful to be back here again. I was here in 2023, and December and September of 2023, so that's over 2.5 years ago. So my wife and I just came back from a vacation in the Far East. We were in Hong Kong and Singapore and Japan. We love Japan. Wonderful. Highly recommend if you go to vacation, Japan is a great place to visit. So tonight we're going to talk about human evolution, and just to let you know, we're not in favor of it. We don't think it's true. But everybody in the world has been told that is true. So we want to examine this and see really what is the basis for this. Why do people believe that humans evolved from some kind of an ape-like ancestor? Where do they get that from? And what is the evidence? And how compelling is the evidence? And really the big question is, why does it matter? If it doesn't matter, then it's just a topic of interest. Well, we believe it is a vital interest. It talks about who we are as human beings. Are we created in the image of God, or are we in the image of some long-dead ape? Knowing that will determine how you treat other people, right? How we view other humans. Okay, so this is not just a theoretical, it has really great implications. So we're going to look at that, and as the pastor mentioned, after that we'll have a Q&A session. I'm not sure how long this will go. On my vacation, I did a lot of research while I was on vacation, so hopefully. One of the big reasons why this is important to the Christian church is because Christianity loses a lot of its young people along the way. This is probably not a surprise to you, especially if you're parents and find that some of your children aren't interested in Christianity or have turned their back on Christianity. And there is some justification for why they would. If you do not believe that God created or that God even exists, why would you be a Christian? If you believe that humans evolved from some ape-like ancestor, why would you be a Christian? Because the idea that God created, of course, is vital. It's critical, and it's critical to Christianity. But we've been told all the time that we evolved. Over something like 1 billion years, we came from a very simple creature to a complex one, and we are here today. Apparently all the scientists believe that, and only a few people, those fundamentalists, those Bible-believing Christians, don't. But is that true? Okay, even that question is true. So here's some books, and of course I'm not telling you anything that you're not familiar with. So Creation Ministries International, we're in 7 countries around the world, and Canada is one of them, of course. We have PhD scientists who are on staff, most of them in the United States and also in Australia, who do a lot of the research for the material in the books, what published on the web, etc. So I'm what they call I'm just a generalist speaker. I'm not full-time, I'm just a part-time speaker. They give me an itinerary and go across the country. I'll call a remote speaker. So I've been doing this for 13 years with Creation Ministries International, all across the country. I even did it on some cruise ship around Australia. So now I can say I'm an international speaker, right? So our scientists and some of you, they review all this material and produce it for the web, etc. We have an increasing presence on social media. I don't know if you've seen some of those little shorts. Some of them are excellent. And one day you might even see me. We do also have this year at the end of August a super conference in Ontario. And this super conference is where hundreds of people come and hear the top speakers for this topic on creation evolution from across the country. I will be one of those speakers. I have to give 2 talks. And one of them is on this. Okay, so this is more of a dress rehearsal for the big talk. Okay. So we have a powerful website called creation.com, and I'm going to ask those ladies to pass around the clipboard for signing up if you would like our info bites. And all you have to do is put your name and email address, and then you will be connected. How many people got info bites and found out about this event? Anybody? No? Okay. Guess you heard it from other means. Good. Why is it important to the gospel? As you know, Christianity, the heart of it is the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. That is the heart of the Christian message. And so, why then did Jesus have to die on the cross? What is the connection between Genesis and between the gospel account? Well, Jesus died on the cross because of Adam's sin. God had created humans perfect. He said everything was very good. But of course we know the story that Adam said, "No, God, I don't believe you. I don't think I'm going to die when I don't take you at the word." But of course God says, "No, you will. You are going to die." And so we have death and disease and suffering. We have spiritual, physical, and eternal death. For those who are unsaved, eternity apart from God is their destiny. That's what the gospel tells us. Well, then what's the remedy? Well, the remedy, of course, is that Christ has come to pay for our sin. As the Apostle Paul says, "For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead also comes through a man. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive." So we were at a perfect state. Humanity, when they were created, we fell because of sin into a state of separation from God. So if we want to be reunited with God, we need Jesus Christ in our life to reverse what Adam did. But this only makes sense if there was an actual Adam. If there was no Adam, then exactly for whose sin did Jesus die? And so this is well known. In fact, atheists understand this sometimes better than Christians. And this was a Frank Zidler, an American atheist back in 1996, who was debating Dr. William Lane Craig, who, by the way, does not believe there was a literal Adam who married Eve, etc. He moved away from that. He said if there never was an Adam and Eve, there never was an original sin. Well, that would be true. If there never was an original sin, there's no need of a Savior. No need of salvation. And if there's no need of salvation, there is no need of a Savior. And he says, I submit that puts Jesus, historical or otherwise, into the ranks of the unemployed. I think that evolution is absolutely the death knell of Christianity. So he gets the link between a real historical Adam and the gospel account. There's no Adam, there's no gospel. Christianity is meaningless. So, holding on to a literal historical Adam who lived about 6,000 years ago, and where do we get that age from? Where do we get 6,000 years? We get it from the genealogies. Adam and Eve, of course, had Cain and Abel, but they also had Seth. And Seth then had Enoch, and all the way down, all the way to Jesus. The genealogies all the way in Matthew, Genesis 5, 11, Chronicles, and Matthew and Luke trace Jesus' descendant all the way to, physical descendants, all the way to Adam. But if there was no Adam, then who is Jesus descended from? Physically. An ape man? We don't think so. Okay, so you see the connection between a literal Genesis and the gospel. But, of course, we've been told that no, humans came about by a very long process. Started out as an ape-like creature and has evolved from a stooped-over creature to a full upright human being. You've seen this picture, or variations of it, called the March of Progress, or the Ape Parade. It's everywhere. You see that on, well, everywhere. You see that for even on Montana Montana restaurants. You see that? Progression, and the guy and the end is, frying on a barbecue. That's kind of the epitome of humanity, is going to Montana's restaurant. But anyway, you've seen this all the time. But the Bible tells us that God created mankind in His image. But that's quite a bit different than being in the ape's image, isn't it? It's one or the other. It cannot be both. Either we're created in God's image, in which there is a literal Adam, etc., or we are descended from apes. All right, so let's look at that. Where did this idea come from? Well, we're going to see why it's justified. I don't know if we have audio on this. I'm going to skip this. Can you play this audio? Yeah. We don't have audio out of this, huh? No, sorry. Anyway, this is a very good video. He's talking about the stuff that I'm going to be talking about in English, but we're going to skip it. So, didn't have audio. Back in 1960s, I remember as a young man, very young, very, very. But anyway, they had the books from Time Life called Early Man. And they had this fold-out pages, as you see here. Now, I was going to Catholic school at that time, just north of Toronto. And I remember pulling it out and said, oh, look at all the fossil evidence they have for human evolution. Why, going back millions of years, they have all these fossils. Well, if they have all these fossils, then I guess it must be true, right? I didn't know any better. Nobody was talking about creation, or that there was even, actually at that time, the creation science movement, there wasn't one. Everybody said, well, if that's what scientists say, I guess we evolved from apes. Okay, until about the 60s and 70s and 80s. Then, of course, now it's become much more full-blown. But back then, the church had said, yeah, if that's what those scientists say, that's what we'll go with. Okay, but it's interesting to note, I remember looking at this picture, but I don't remember reading the text on the lower left side. Because the guy who made this admitted, he said here, many of the figures shown here are built up from far fewer fragments. A jaw, some teeth perhaps, as indicated white, and thus are products of educated guessing. In other words, he even said in writing, I'm guessing at this stuff. Okay? But even if later finds should dictate changes, these reconstructions serve a purpose in showing how these creatures might have looked. In other words, he was guessing, and he was making this stuff up. He also said this, although proto-apes, that is before apes, and apes are quadrupedal, meaning they walked on 4 legs, he says all are shown here standing for comparison purposes. He knew that these guys on the left were just apes. They walked on 4 legs. But he showed them standing up to create the illusion that eventually they would walk upright and become man. So this is propaganda, pure propaganda. And it has worked. It has powerfully worked. So even this day, even though scientists know that this is not true, they still use it because it's used for propaganda purpose, convincing people of what's actually not even true. In fact, many well-known scientists will tell you this is an illusion. They don't even believe this anymore. But they're not going to tell you they don't believe it because they want you to accept the whole theory. So let's go back on the evolutionary timeline. How do scientists make sense of this? Well, apparently that there was a Catarrhina, or old world monkeys, way, way in the distant past. And then about 11 million years ago, there was a split for the line that went to chimps and humans, which we'll talk about in depth, but also went to apes. Now, you remember that when I started on the title says, making a monkey out of you. Okay? You probably heard it said, well, if we evolved from monkeys, how come they're still monkeys? You ever heard of that? Yeah, that's not the theory of evolution. Nobody says we evolved from monkeys. If you start talk about monkeys, you don't know what you're talking about. Don't ever say that. Okay? It's apes. And what's the difference between an ape and a monkey? Apes do not have tails. Monkeys have tails. Okay? So let's be very clear. We have believed to have descended from an ape-like ancestor. So if you're going to critique an idea, you have to understand what the idea is in the first place. So about 11 million years ago, they say, that there was a branching off which led to apes today, bonobos and great apes, etc. Okay. And so that led to about 6 to 7 million years ago, there was a common ancestor to a line that split off for humans to the most advanced human we have today, right? And the chimp line. So the chimps went their way, and human went their own way. Okay? So about 6 to 7 million years ago, there was an ape-like ancestor, what we call the last common ancestor of humans and chimps. Okay, we're defining the terminology here now so you can understand it. But let's go back a little. Okay, so you'll see that's where that ape parade comes in, from the last common ancestor to us today. All right. But it's interesting, though, and I just came across this while I was on vacation, that there was a fossil found in 2019 called Danuvius guggenmosi. They'd make these weird names up, okay? But it's interesting because according to Smithsonian Magazine, this Danuvius, this thing, okay, lived about 11.6 million years ago, and it was swinging from trees and walking on 2 legs. Now we're going to see that this is very significant because this fossil is sort of alleging that that these creatures walked on 2 legs long before 2 legs were actually evolved. Well, wait a minute now. You can't have... Anyway, we'll see in a minute. Okay, just remember this. Okay? All right, so here's the theory of evolution. Basically, the ape parade. So about 67 million years ago, we started evolving from an ape-like ancestor and through apes, and we're going to see. And so they call this the major group, now there are a few minor ones, the Australopithecines, or Australopithecus. So the fossils, they start with the prefix A, which means Australopithecus, okay, which means southern ape. That's really what the word means. So when you say we are supposed to evolve from apes, that is true. Southern apes, right? Australopithecines. And eventually we became humans, and that became the Homo, right? The H in Latin really means just man. All right, so this is the broad outline for it. We're going to get into more depth of this. So where did this come from? Well, Charles Darwin, in his idea about evolution, had to come up with a plan for how do you get humans. Okay? He wanted everything to be a purely natural process. God had nothing to do with it. Darwin was very clear, God must have nothing to do with evolution. Which is rather ironic because he got a master's degree in theology from Cambridge University. But his theory said, no, I want nothing to do with my theory if any supernatural involvement. Purely natural processes. So this is actually very famous. It's called Darwin's I think idea. So on that point one is, he said, well, there was this primordial soup and some chemicals and sparks, etc., and life began, and everything descended from there and branched off. And that theory has been going on today. The only trouble is, it doesn't work. In fact, scientists admit that this tree of life doesn't actually work. That's what New Scientist article was saying. He says it's too simple. In fact, life didn't evolve once, it evolved multiple times. I was just listening to recently about where do whales come from. Well, you got to explain whales from a natural process. No, they weren't created, that's not allowed. So how do you come from? Where do you think whales came from? They came from land. A land animal decided he wanted to go into salt water and start living, and over 15 million years became whales. That's how whales came from. Really? But this expert saying, not just once, they did that 10 times. 10 times over. These creatures decided they're supposed to come from water onto land. They didn't like the land. They decided to go back into the water. Right? All we have, and this is so much evidence they say they have of that. That's another talk, but that's nuts. So one of the ideas they come up with today is called the braided stream. This is one of the most current ideas, is not a tree of life, but a braided stream. Right? So you have this gnarly tree, which has all these branches, but they're disconnected. Branches have fallen off. So, and you see the timeline on the right-hand side going down about 6 million years. Right? So they have this idea, humans evolved from an ape-like ancestor, but a lot of stops and starts and gaps and pieces missing, but we're still convinced it happened. But the big question, you see all these trunks, etc.? Yeah, that's imagination. That's not actually real. All you have is a whole bunch of fossils, which in the minds they're connecting the dots. But how do you connect them? They kind of look the same, or what? Let me give you an analogy of this. My wife is not here tonight. She's a musician, so she's in a practice for one of her music groups that she's in. So her last name is Brown. And everybody, of course, wants to know if they're descended from royalty, right? My ancestry goes back to the 1500s. We trace it all the back 1500s. Ironically, we're dairy farmers in Holland, in the Netherlands. Okay, so no money there, I'm afraid, right? But so, wondered, is my wife related to a lady in the 1100s, Lady Brown? Oh, if my wife could be royalty, all right? So, obviously, Lady Brown had descendants, and the names changed. The different countries, Le Brun, and they have all different names in different countries, are descended, for could be related. But how do we know, how can you prove that my wife is related to her, Lady Brown? What would you need? Well, you would need some records. You need birth records, death records, marriage records, all of those things. Now, many times churches, like in my case, going back to the 1500s, there is church records going back. But if you don't have those, you have no connection. Now, some people, what about genetics? Well, it only goes back like 4 or 5 generations. It gets diluted too fast. You can't make the connection other than broad groups. Okay, so there's no way to prove that actually my wife is related to her without those records attesting to descendancy. Of course, so, got nothing to prove it. It also makes it much more complicated because there's a lot of people that live since Lady Brown. So how do you know I'm connected? My wife's connected to any of those? Of course, there's no possible way. So the same thing applies to the last common ancestor over 6 million years to present-day humans. So we have fossils all over. Now, we don't agree with the timeline. We think that's way too long, and I'll get to that in a bit here. But, so I got these fossils. How do I connect them to the last common ancestor? Well, the answer is, I'm looking for this path, connects one to another. But how do you know what the path is unless you have written records, which of course don't exist? So what you have then is, you have all these fossils, but you have no real way to connect them. Do you? Other than similarities, they kind of look maybe like, and we're going to look at that in a minute. What does that evidence look like? Like people have once said to me, a number of people said, you look a little bit like Stephen Harper, the former prime minister. Right? Anybody think that? Right? Stephen Harper. I told him that once. I met him at the Calgary airport. I said, some people say we kind of look alike. He kind of looked at me like, not too sure he was happy about that, but anyway. Right? So how can you connect it? So this isn't just me saying this, okay? So this is Dr. John Hawkes, is a paleoanthropologist, very well known in the field. And in a weblog, he put out this picture, actually twice in the same blog. All right, so this is kind of how he sees it. Well, he got it from somebody else. On the left, you have the last common ancestor, and of course, the branching out onto the Australopithecines, right? There you go, the Australopithecus, various varieties, and then off to humans. Okay, now you'll see that there's a relationship line. So this is imagined how this branched off and went that way, another one branched off this way, and the node, or the transition point, is where they split. All right, so this is where at some point in the past they split off. So you must have some physical fossil, right? You would have to have something physical, not just imagination. But the thing is, he doesn't. That lines are just imagination. It's just made up stuff. What you have is, you have these alleged fossils that that existed for a period of time, and you have humans, all the magenta ones are the Australopithecines and variants of them, and they have humans. Okay? But how do you connect them? You can't physically connect them. And this is a well-known problem. In fact, Dr. John Hawkes himself admitted this in a video that he did in Tel Aviv in 2018. He says, and this is kind of an odd statement, I don't know if it's going to translate well. He said this, and you'll notice the illustration he has. All the question marks at those branching points. He says this, we don't know the answers of how all these species are related to each other, but I can tell you that what we mostly don't know is because these different patterns of features are giving us different kinds of evidences about relationships. Translation, when you're looking at the skulls, which is the primary thing that they look at, you try to say, which came before which? What? Well, then you look at the pelvis, the hips. Well, which came before which? Then you look at the length of the arms to the feet ratio, then which came before which? And so he says, we're doing a lot of guessing here. Okay, so then how sure are you of the theory if you're doing a lot of this guessing? He admits it. We don't know a lot of stuff. So that's the question is, how do evolutionists relate humans with extinct apes? First thing is, evolution is true. That's the starting point. They said, we'll work out the details, but we know evolution is true. You see, people like you and me, creationists and Christians, are asking, how do we know it's true? How do we know it's true? But the evolutionists are not asking this question. They're saying, we know it's true, we're just trying to figure out the details. Not asking the same questions. They start off with, We know it's true. We don't think so. Okay? So you've got to ask the question. That's the starting point. So, secondly, if you have to explain how humans came about by purely natural means, you have to have some kind of evolutionary idea. Well, humans probably look more like apes than octopus. Okay? So, they're saying that, well, most likely then, and that's not unreasonable, that if evolution is true, we evolved from something that looks more like us, which is apes. If you go to a gorilla, yeah, it's kind of, could be, maybe, it's got to lose a bit of weight and, hair and all that stuff, but, sure, more than a dog, okay? Right, so then you would say, if that's the case, then we are looking for ape features that relate us to apes. So what similarities prove that we apes evolved into humans? Well, several of the things are this. It is believed that four-legged apes that walked on fours changed to bipedal, walk on two humans. So how would that indicate in the fossil record? Well, one of the things you're going to look to is the change of the pelvis. The pelvis, the bones in the pelvis. Okay? So humans have a much more flared in, and apes have much more broader. Okay? You can tell. Any animal expert or study this stuff can tell the difference between an ape and a human fossil. So you're going to look at something that was flattened, and then you're going to look along the line for something that's getting narrower and narrower. So that's what I'm looking for. And if I find it, it's evidence that this actually happened. The other thing to look for is humans, of course, are intellectually superior to apes. So our brains would have been bigger. So we're going to look at the brain size or the cranial capacity, starting from very small apes, something about 400, 500 cc's, to humans, okay, which is 11 to 12, 1300 cc capacity. All right, so you would think along the way that the cranial capacity would get bigger. So if I find a fossil that had somewhere in between, I'm going to stick it somewhere in the middle. It's got to fit my idea of how humans evolved. Secondly, humans and chimps would have very close DNA, because the genotype leads to the phenotype, right? Your genome, what your genetics expressed in the physical body. So you would think that I'm going to see, if I do genetic studies, I'm going to see that the humans and the chimp DNA, which because we came from the same ancestor, would be very close. And so you probably heard 98.5% commonality between ape and human DNA. Anybody heard that? Nobody's heard that? Or just me? Or anyone want to put your hand? Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, is it true? We're going to see. All right. So, a lot of this material from the book came from this Contested Bones. There are 2 copies there. Excellent book. Excellent. He doesn't bring a creation aside. He just looks at, these 2 guys just look at the evidence and what scientists are actually saying. And what actually scientists are saying will shock you. On YouTube videos, everybody's like, oh, that's shocking. Everything's shocking. Anyhow, all right, let's go back to this braided stream tree of life. Okay, so there was 3 major groups. We're going to get rid of the green ones in a minute, but so about between 6 and 4 million years ago, there's the Ardipithecus, and we'll discount that in shortly. And then there's also the Australopithecines, the Australopithecus variants, and there's the human variants. Okay, I'm going to discount the ones along the bottom here. This is very contested. The bones, if I go back here a second, it's jumbled up. It's very hard to make anything out of it. So we're just going to leave that. It's very much contested as to even if they're along the human line. The Ardipithecines, Dr. Sanford and Roop concluded there's no legitimate evidence to suggest RD, which is short for Ardipithecus, walked upright. So we're going to leave that one and we have enough with the Australopithecines and the Homo variants. Okay. So, I'm going to get rid of that. But one of the things that you will notice is that the Australopithecines and humans were living at the same time. Think about that. It's like saying, I'm living at the same time as my great-great-great-grandfather. How does that work? You can live at the same time. Anyway, so we're going to cover just a few of the fossils. We don't have time to go into all of the various. That book is excellent. There's other books as well on the market. Lucy. You may have heard of Lucy. Australopithecus afarensis. Dr. Johansen discovered this in 1974. It's over 50 years. In fact, it was the 50th anniversary of the finding of this fossil. And he believed that this was 3 to 4 million years old. A lot of scientists disagreed with him. And one of the things is that they rejected this because of the dates. They said it was too early. It looked a little human-like. It wouldn't fit in the timeline. However, most people think that Lucy is actually an ape-like ancestor, somewhere between ape and us. It's an icon. When somebody said Lucy, I know what that was. I don't even know what. I can't say Australopithecus afarensis, but I know Lucy. Okay. You will notice one thing, that in the depictions of these fossils, you only see the pelvis. You do not see the skull. Why is that? Everything else is a skull. Why is it Lucy? Well, because there wasn't a whole lot to find. Those pieces in brown were the actual fossils. The white stuff is plaster. It's made up. You can see the fossil on the top itself. The original Lucy fossil, there's not much. How can you make a face out of that? Anything other than just a bunch of bones. And look at her pelvis. Not even half was there. And yet Lucy is the icon of this. Okay. So, in November 11, 2024, in Scientific American, Lucy was highlighted. I remember reading this article. It says it was Lucy's fossils evolutionary journey to become an icon of human evolution. Notice the byline here. The 3.2 million year old human ancestor known as Lucy rose to fame through an incredible combination of circumstances. Okay. So, I'm going to read this because it's a lot longer. One of the reasons Lucy is special is that she is a recognizable skeleton, albeit an incomplete one. Another is that the skeleton is enough like our own for researchers to think Lucy's ills could be a close relative and possibly even an ancestor. Hey, wait a minute now. The tie line says she was. Now you're saying could be an ancestor? All right. An ancestor of modern humans. All right. Some experts think Lucy belongs on the line leading to modern humans. Well, most people have been told that, right? Right? Adding to her cachet. But ancestry is difficult to demonstrate. You have no written records. Nobody saw this. So you're just making stuff up and imagining this, and almost impossible to prove. With the patchy fossil record we have for very early hominins that humans have. He's admitting. Now this is one of the leading lights, Dr. Bernard Wood, okay, in this field. He goes on, the number of such skeletons in the early stage of the human fossil record can be counted on the fingers of one hand. You thought there was all this big pile of fossil evidence. No, he said, this is the expert. One hand, this is the fossils we have. And we make a story going back 6 million years. Wow. Notice this. Even if Australopithecus afarensis is not our ancestor, it was very likely to be a close relative. So from sure she is to, well, she may not have been. This is science? This is the stuff that they're feeding us, telling us, oh, we're absolutely sure about this, and but admit it, well, even the experts aren't so sure, are they? I think that's telling. As I mentioned before, that the Australopithecines and the humans lived at the same time, according to the evolutionary ideas, which caused Dr. Charles Oxnard, I'm not sure he's alive still, but in 1983 he said this, because of this reason they lived at the same time, the Australopithecines, known over the last several decades, are now irrevocably removed from a place in the evolution of human bipedalism. All this should make us wonder about the usual presentation of human evolution in introductory textbooks. So it says, according to our idea of how going from four-legged to two-legged, he says, we should get rid of the Australopithecines. Which leaves you with what? Nothing. You have this multi-million year gap of nothing. This wasn't expert. Now, they forgot about what he said. They didn't take into court, because when you knock off half of the whole story, you haven't got much of a story. Interesting. Let's look at a few other things here. So we'll look at all these. Here's the top. Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens means wise man. That's what it means, wise man. But, so we have all these different Homo variants. Homo neanderthalis and Homo rudolphinus and heidelbergensis. Perhaps all of these are humans. Maybe they're all just humans. Just variations in human. Think about pygmies, right? Pygmies are like 4 feet tall people. Are they human or are they apes? Or halfway in between? Well, they're fully human, aren't they? Right? But if you were to take their skull, of course it's like a lot, but half the size of an average human, we would have put them in the ape category. Right? In fact, there's a historical record of Otanbenge, I think it was, taken from Africa, put in a zoo in New York, claiming that, if you want I can pull up the picture later, but he died and he committed suicide. Because he was an African, I think from Congo, and they said, oh, look, it's an ape-like ancestor. So, what makes us human? Well, we have carefully crafted tools, we speak complex languages, we think in the abstract, tell stories. As per the evolutionists, they love telling stories, but utilize fire for various purposes, heat, light, metalworking, create art, music, painting, sculpture, architecture, photography. We do ceremonial burial, religious observance, we walk upright. Which, when you think about it, God had created humans in his image. Why? He said this, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea, and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the land. So this is what we call the Great Commission, right? Or the dominion mandate, right? So God had created Adam and Eve and said, listen, you're not just here to run around and have fun in the Garden of Eden. I set you here for a purpose. You are to take dominion over the entire planet. And I would imagine, he said, be fruitful and multiply. Actually, in the case of my wife and I, there's 2 of us. We have 4 sons and now 8 grandchildren. You see, we do now with this mathematically. We're working out very well. 2, 4, 8, okay. Great-grandchildren, probably, anyway. But, so God had given Adam and Eve the capacity, the mental skills, and the talents in order to do that. You think, I'm thinking that God is saying, you know, Adam and Eve, I planted you in this garden. It's fantastic, isn't it? I want you to spread this around the entire planet. As your population increases, you extend the garden. And all over. So that eventually the planet could become a veritable planet of Eden. But we know what happened. Adam said, I don't think so. I got better plans. I'm going to become like you. Wow. And lost all of this. That's why there was a book, Milton, Paradise Lost. Rather than fulfilling the mandate that God had given to humans, humans decided, no, we're going to do something different. We're going to take over. We're going to be the boss. Adam, you're the second most powerful being on this earth. It's all yours. Crazy. So what about the timeline of human origins according to the Bible? Well, according to Genesis account, we were created about 6,000 years ago according to the genealogies I mentioned before. And of course you have genealogy of chapter 5. And after about 1,656 years, there was a global flood. Now there's, in modern science today, and if you're going to university and you're studying science today, there's 2 things that are not allowed. They're not permitted for discussion or inclusion in any scientific enterprise. God, or any supernatural agency, and the global flood. It's not permitted. No scientist can submit a paper advocating that there was a design agency to God or there was a global flood. Just not allowed. Because that's the way science has gone. Instead of looking at all the evidence, they're saying no, it's only naturalism. It is ruled by naturalism, materialism. All explanations must be natural. And so you have ideas like Big Bang. Doesn't work, but we have to use it anyway. Okay. So, but the Bible tells us differently. In the beginning, God created. How did God create? I don't know. He just spoke and it was. Right? God's not going to explain it because It's not natural. It's an outside of our... Right? And about 4,500 years ago, there was a global flood. Well, what about all these fossils? They're just extinct humans. We're going to see that later on. So there were the apes, Australopithecines, okay, they were an extinct variant of apes, and they died out. Many of them would have died out in the flood, and that's why we have the fossil. That's how you make a fossil. You have to bury it, right? And of course, some of the humans were also buried, like Homo erectus and Neanderthal, and etc. So all of these are simply just archaic or versions or variants of humans that no longer exist. Possibly they do, but most of them do not. Okay. All right, so we don't have millions of years to work with. Okay, and there's a good reason for that. All right, so let's look at this. So there was a find in 2013. There was a finding in a cave of these fossils. Find may prove branches from human family tree. So in a paper in journal Science, there were 5 skulls found, and from allegedly Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and Homo erectus. And they were all buried in the same place. And the conclusion, now this is from Science, this is not from a creation organization. The explanation of this is clear. All 3 species must be one and the same. Think about that. What was considered those 3 versions are separate. They're all the same. They just have given different names, but it's all the same. He says, differences once perceived to be a mark of separate species are in fact the result of normal variation in physical features, age, and gender, they say. This is what the scientists are saying. He said, we call them different species, but actually they're all in the same, and they're just variants of humans. Go along with it. Like Homo floresiensis, or the Hobbit. You see that very small, diminutive people, very small head, off of an island called Flores, north of Australia. And these now extinct humans stood less than 4 feet tall, it was about this tall, with brains 1/3 the size of living people, probably about 400 or 500 cc's. Yet they made stone tools, butchered meat, and somehow crossed miles of ocean to colonize their tropical home. Well, if they're in boats, if they're sailing, if they're navigating, if they're using tools, if they're butchering meat, etc., then guess what they would have been? Humans. We don't see apes on boats, do we? They've had a long time to evolve to becoming using boats, but they don't use boats. Okay, so it's interesting. In the Natural History Museum in Britain and UK, I found this interesting. The question, in the same web page, so is Homo floresiensis a separate human species? Yes. While we don't know all the answers to how it developed its unique set of traits, Homo floresiensis is a distinct human species. And then further on down in the same page, why was Homo floresiensis so small? Some other scientists suggested that Homo floresiensis is not a distinct species, but rather a population of Homo sapiens with a condition such as microcephaly, where the brain develops to a smaller size. So in the same article, it's yes and no. So what's the answer? Take your pick. Okay? There's no evidence that anything other than a human, based on all of it. Depends on what you want the answer to be, right? What about Homo erectus? In 1891, Eugene Dubois, right? He was Dutch. He uncovered the first fossil of Homo erectus. Now, erectus are robust. The rib cage is much bigger. They're more powerful. They have actually a larger brain capacity than Homo sapiens. Wait a minute. If Homo erectus is before us, and I thought brain size increasing was a sign that we are advancing, how come modern humans have a smaller brain than Homo erectus? What happened? Did our brains start shrinking again? Well, that would be the theory, wouldn't it? So he found about 300 Homo erectus finds thus far, including Java man, Peking man, Homo ergaster, Turkana boy, etc. I remember hearing all of these names. In fact, many, many more names. We'll get to that. What happened to all of them? Okay. However, they found that in The Guardian, for example, Homo erectus may have been a sailor and able to speak. Well, new theory suggests that Homo erectus was able to create sea-going vessels and must have used language to sail successfully. Well, what are they then? Human. They're just humans. Okay? In fact, some creation scientists believe or suggest that maybe Adam and Eve were Homo erectus. They would have had the larger sized brain. They were taller, stronger, and over time we have lost. You know, that's what actually happens over time. The increasing mutations, we're actually getting worse, not getting better. Okay, so here we have a skull. What do you think this skull is? Notice the projecting brows. Okay, what do you think this creature might have been? Any ideas? Anybody? Volunteer? Any information? Nobody? You might think of Homo erectus, maybe Neanderthal, right? Maybe? No. This is Homo sapiens. This is humans. From the National History of the Smithsonian Natural Museum History, Earhood 1 is considered a human Homo sapien. And yet look at, that looks exactly like Homo erectus. So on what basis? Now interesting, Neanderthal. Anybody heard of Neanderthal? Everybody heard of Neanderthal. So when this was apparently an accurate reconstruction of the prehistoric caveman. Look at that accurate reproduction. Came out in 1909. Well, that certainly looks a bit like somewhere between a gorilla and a human, doesn't it? Very hairy and ugly and right? Strong limbs, kind of like a gorilla, half man, something like that. Well, this creature certainly has evolved a lot in the last 100 years, because now this is what they think he looks like. Neanderthal, over 500 skeletons found in Europe, Middle East, Western Asia, right? And it's now considered extinct version of humans. Well, wait a minute, how can it be just humans? He lived alongside and bred with modern humans, and in fact, European and Asians have between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, which means that Neanderthals and humans interbred and had children, which means they're the same species. By definition of species is that which can interbreed, which can reproduce, fertile offspring. So Neanderthal is just a human variant. Okay? These guys look the same? Almost the same. Actor Josh Brolin, right? Like, on what basis are we calling Neanderthal? I worked with the guy who I swear looked Neanderthal. He had this brow went right across his forehead, a little sticking out. I didn't want to say anything, but I said, man, I was going to think, man, you fit the bill. And yet, but he was working. He was alive. Wow, crazy. All right. Look at this guy, Nikola Valuev. Look, compared to the guy next to him. Who's the human? Right? Who's the human? Who's the ancestor to whom? This guy's massive, 7 foot. He was a Russian politician and former professional boxer. I certainly wouldn't want to go in the ring with him. But look at him. If you were to take his skull, kill him of course, but they have to take his skull, what would you say he was? Whatever you want him to be. Interesting. So when you look at the skulls at the American Museum of Natural History, they have it all lined out, from the ape-like creature to the modern man, and here we got all these fossils based on very highly subjective claims. They look like they fit, but we have no records, we have no evidence, there's no science, it's just elegant. Here we have a range of human heads. Think about that. The great variety of human skulls. Well, who's ancestral to whom? They're all living people. Okay? You can't base it on skulls, and yet that's the basis of human evolution theory. Interesting it is. Here you see all these skulls. What do you think we're looking at here? If you look at the very far right, of course, they have a very big jaw projecting, and on the left is very, smaller head and shorter jaw. So what are these? Modern humans. Asian, European, Australian, African. This is the range of skulls for existing people. When you look at, Aboriginal and Asian derived, they are very different. And yet they're exactly modern. They're all humans. Okay? There's no sign of evolution in these creatures. Now, Dr. Carl Werner a medical physician, actually, I heard him once at one of those super conferences, and he and his wife went to 65 natural history museums and talked to the scientist, the evolutionary scientist, and asked him about the fossil. He didn't tell them he was a creationist or why he was doing it. He was doing a movie, a documentary, and so he went in and asked them all about all kinds of fossils. Show me the fossils, let me take pictures of the skull. Here we have the Turkana boy skull in Kenya, etc. So he got access to a lot of these things. And what he did was he compiled all of these records. He spent a lot of work in it. And we'll mention the books later. But he says, as he went through this, now I got an online copy of his book. He had so many footnotes that he published another book just for the footnotes. So obviously he did a lot of work, and the guy's brilliant, and he did it. Now what he came across was 237 ape men which were overturned. In other words, that were once presented to the public as evidence from ape to human evolution, which have been withdrawn. Now you never hear about that. You only hear about the ones. Every week there's some new fossil that has been found, etc. And it's, but he says 237 which were once presented, including on that fold-out, which have now been debunked. 237. So some of them were, and he actually put them into 9 categories. For example, Tetrapomorpho argentis was made from a raccoon leg bone. Presented to the public. Later it turns out raccoon leg bone. Hesperopithecus Harold Cookie was from a pig's tooth. Wow, that was presented to the public. Other ones were recently buried. One guy actually dug up the skull from his great-grandmother and presented to the public as an ancestor of humans. 100-year-old grandmother. It's kind of macabre. Or all about this, using monkey bones. Australopithecus prometheus. I remember this one coming out. He said this is actually from monkey bones. And another one's from Proconsul africanus, was made from reptile bones. 237, and they've been gone. That's why Dr. Carl Hawk says the evidence is like the palm of one hand. Because a lot of it's presented in, oops, please take that back. You don't know about that stuff. So he did all of this in 2 books. We don't carry these books. I don't have any here. But excellent line if you ever want to get that. A lot of research went into that. And if anybody's studying human evolution, this is the book to get. Okay, these are the books to get. Interesting to note that the experts in the field, like Dr. Ian Tattersall, who is a curator emeritus of the anthropology of the American Museum of Natural History, probably the premier museum covering this, he said this in 2012. Even allowing for the poor record we have of our close extinct kin, Homo sapiens appears as distinct and unprecedented. There is certainly no evidence to support the notion that we gradually became who we inherently are over an extended period in either the physical or intellectual sense. This is an expert in the field saying that humans came on the scene without anybody before them. Wait a minute. I thought we were... Okay. Now, in a number of years ago, because of all of this, what these experts are saying, they put together a committee, at a high-level committee of these experts, and say, what is the state of this science of human evolution? Paleoanthropology, what's the state of it? And a report was published, back in 2021. So, this is the report. It was published by the American Museum of Natural History. So, when you look at the narrative for hominin origins, it's just a big mess. There's no consensus whatsoever, said Sergio Almizgai, a senior research scientist and the lead author of the review. He said, many of the fossils show features that do not match expectations for ancient representatives of the modern ape to human lineages. As a consequence, there is no scientific consensus on the evolutionary role played by these fossil apes. Think about that. We have all these fossils. The experts are saying, well, we're not sure about it. He says, overall, the research has found that most stories of human origins are not compatible with the fossils that we have today. This is in 2021. Latest findings. It's a mess. We can't connect them all together. But you, because you just look at the pictures, have been told that ape parade is true, when it isn't even something evolutionists believe in. So there's a lot of propaganda going on here. Because if they admit that human evolution isn't true, what happens to the theory of evolution? It falls apart. And if there's anything they don't want, is that to happen. Okay, a few other things. So the realistic view of hominid evolution is that, yes, there were apes and extinct versions of them, and we have the fossils of them. And yes, there are humans, Homo erectus, Neanderthal, they're all simply humans. Many of them died out, shared our genetic code. Maybe we were originally Homo erectus, hard to say, right? But the long-sought missing links between apes and humans are still missing, and we contend because they never existed. And as admitted, the fossil evidence does not give us any support that there were any. All right. You may have heard about that humans, we mentioned it first, are 98.5% similar to chimps. Now, and people are saying, well, that proves we're almost monkeys, or apes, I shouldn't say monkeys, right? That's the proof right there. And a lot of people throw this out, and many people said, well, I guess it sort of sounds like, well, maybe. Okay, so the idea is this, that about 6 to 7 million years, the last common ancestors we split. So as you know, that over time, mutations occur in the genetic code. Right now, in the human genetic code, there's over 255,000 documented genetic mutations. These act as markers. And you can look in the genetic code. Actually, if anything is happening in the medical field now is genetic engineering. Trying to, with technology like CRISPR, to fix these genetic problems before they're expressed in a human body. Sometimes they can go in vitro while the baby is inside and fix some of the genetics so they're not born with it. Okay? It has a lot of promise to fixing things. It's also scary about what they can do with genetic engineering. All right? But, so, chimps have also accumulated over time, if the story is true, their mutations over time, and humans over time. And so these mutations, they believe, act like a clock, right? So you calculate a mutation here, mutation, add them all up. So we should have, humans went separate ways from apes, or chimps, we should have a difference of a certain percentage of our DNA. So when they looked at it, they said, well, it's about in about 6 to 7 million years, we're about 99% the same. Which they said, well, it fits. And so many mutations over millions of years, yeah, the math fits. Okay. But there's several things here. Number one, does commonality prove common ancestry? Because things look the same, does that mean they came from the same source, the same origin? That's a good question, right? Just because it looks like, just because I look kind of like Stephen Harper, or he looks like me, does that mean we share the same parents? No. It's just similar. Okay? How? So look at, no, it is an expectation of common design. God could have made humans and apes 99.99% similar. Okay? But we're not, and that would explain why we have similar structures and features. We have similar organs, okay? We have heart, liver, etc. We have sort of the same. Now, of course, between octopus, whatever, we have a lot of genetic differences. So God could have made any similarities He wanted, okay? But if you look at, I was in aviation for 45 years, and so you look at these airplanes. Now, if you follow the evolution of aviation from the start, they don't look anything like this, okay? But now the airplanes all sort of looking the same. And I can tell you, as someone who is an expert in the field, I'm having difficulty figuring out which one it is. Because they all sort of look the same. But does that prove they're all made by the same come out of the same factory? No. Now, some of them, all the Boeings come out of the same factory, and all the Airbus come out of the same factory, but it's because they use the same design principles. And we know this is the case because the engineers who work on Airbus also go to Boeing, also go to Bombardier, which is the bottom aircraft. Okay? And they move around because they get the jobs when they move open. So they have all the same design carry over. I mean, an engineer is not going to start from scratch for every time they build something. They're going to say, what exists already? I'm going to use that, modified, etc. Just like cars. Cars all have 4 wheels. Nobody's reinventing the 4-wheel car and making 5 wheels. Okay? And so it's all because common engineering principles are used over and over again, which is an expectation of what God would do. He used the DNA as the master code, and from there, you can get all the variants of humans today. He also used this DNA in other creatures. In fact, in trees, in all organic living things have DNA. Wow. Well, that makes sense if you're a designer, creator. Why don't I start with this master, this amazing. If you ever do any genetic, that's not my field, but if you ever do any study of that, it's incredibly complex. Business jets, I'm familiar with. That's easy. Genetics, right? So let's just talk a little bit about this, okay? The genetic difference between all human beings is about 0.1%. Percent. Well, that's and all human beings that exist alive today, it's only 0.1% difference. That represents 0.1 of 3 billion letters in the genetic code, right? So that's a lot of differences. And all of that explains all the different variations of humans. Wow, okay. But between chimps and humans, they're saying when it's about 1.2%. That's where you get the 98.5, 98.7%. And they said, well, but 2 things here. Number 1 is this was measuring the base building blocks of shared genes. In other words, only about 2% of your DNA is actually used for a coding region, they call it, for actually making you physical stuff. The rest of 98% is non-coding. And originally thought this was all junk DNA. It was left over somewhere evolutionary path. It really didn't do anything. But that field has changed long ago. Okay? They're finding out that in this non-coding region, they're doing what they call epigenetics. They're finding that a whole bunch of functions are in there. Massive amounts of functions. Okay, so they're finding out that we thought this didn't do anything. Now we realize it does a lot. Much of it is in the embryonic, in the development stage in the womb, because you have to go from a cell into developed spine and organs, etc., brains, etc., all that, and out comes a baby fully formed. Wow, it's incredible how all this engineering goes work, right? But it was also based on an unsequenced chimpanzee DNA. They hadn't fully sequenced the entire chimpanzee genome. And yet they're comparing the regions that are similar. Well, if you're comparing what's similar, then yes, they're going to be similar by 99%. But you didn't sequence the entire thing. Okay? Now this is a little dated, but the Smithsonian admits that when you did the entire region, it was 4 and 5% difference. Even back then. So that means that it wasn't 98.5%, they all knew that. It was somewhere in the order of 94%. That was up till last year. But before we get to that, right, Smithsonian admits that between about 94%, it's still on the website now, but you know that dogs are 94% similar to humans? We're closer actually and cats about 90%, and we're about 60% similar DNA to bananas and fruit flies. Which might explain sometimes when people go bananas that, it's in our genes, right? But wait a minute, what does this percent prove anyway? Really, doesn't prove a whole lot. But that was until last year. So what happened was, okay, in 2025, published in Nature, there was an article published, you et al., and when they actually did the analysis in the supplemental, they fully sequenced the entire chimp DNA, and they had fully sequenced the humans. And when they put them side by side, they found they weren't just 1% different, they were 15% different. 15%. Wow. Oops, sorry. Go ahead. That is huge. That is huge. It's massive. Okay, now, the evolutionists have basically said, you don't understand DNA, you're all stupid, you don't understand that. But even you et al. Had put it in the supplementary notes. So that's why intelligent design advocates and creationists are saying, hey, wait a minute. You've actually had the scientific data, but are keeping mum about this. Simply because the findings hurt your cause, don't they? Well, what does that really mean, though? So we mentioned that there was 3 billion letters in the human DNA. A 1% difference is 30 million differences. 30 million differences, which have to be accounted for if you're going to go from a common ancestor in 6 million years. So 1%, they say, well, 1%, 30 million, okay, if 6 million years, we do a certain rate of change, maybe we could get this in 6 million years, all these changes. But multiply that by 15 times, something like 450 million changes? 450 million changes, 6 million years? Absolutely impossible. No way. You'd have to be mutating like 1,000 times a generation. And we know that mutations, about 10,000 to 1, are harmful. If there are, as I mentioned, 255,000 harmful mutations already cataloged, very few, less than 10 beneficial mutations. So you're telling me that if I mutate, I'm only getting worse. Time makes it worse, it doesn't make it better. So this was an interesting revelation on this. And it's clear evidence that humans and apes do not share a common ancestor. This is a scientific case. It's pointed. Mitochondria DNA. Okay. Now this is a little deeper here. Mitochondria DNA. Our mitochondria is the energy center of the cell. Let me know if I'm wrong here, right? And in the mitochondria you have DNA. Now this DNA is only passed along by the mother. That's why this DNA is what's checked in Ancestry.com, in Ancestry test, because it's only passed along to your maternal line. Okay? So, DNA studies have said, and this was it, mitochondrial DNA studies have shown all people living today can be traced back to a common maternal ancestor. They call her Mitochondria Eve, who lived in Africa approximately 150,000 years ago. Over time, man journeyed out of Africa and populated the rest of the world. Now, this 150,000 years ago was based on the rate of mutations in the mitochondria DNA. Again, you're applying a clock to the mitochondria DNA. And according to the evolutionary theory, if humans came out of Africa 150,000 years ago, we should have had certain rate of mutations per generation multiplied by so many generations. Except, now that's the theoretical part of it. When they actually went and did a study of the actual rate of mutation in mitochondria, they found that it was much, much faster than they thought. So this is an article from Science in their 1998 called Calibrating the Mitochondrial Clock. Regardless of the cause, evolutionists are most concerned about the effect of a faster mutation rate. And well, they should be. For example, researchers have calculated that Mitochondria Eve, the woman whose mitochondrial DNA was ancestor to all the living people, lived 100 to 200,000 years ago in Africa, just like we just said. Using the new clock, which is called the pedigree clock, she would be a mere 6,000 years old, based on actual measurements of decay of mitochondria, of the rate of mutation. But no one thinks that's the case. And that's why evolutionists are concerned. Because when you actually look at the science, you test it, you find out it gives you 6,000 years. We don't want that. We're going with this slower number. Takes a longer time because it has to fit into our theory. So So who's actually following the science here? If you don't like the results, well, you just ignore them. Boom, boom, boom. Okay. Also, when they did the Y chromosome. Now, these are the sex chromosome. This is what's passed on to the next generation. So if we were indeed descended from apes, we should have very similar Y chromosomes, in the male only, of course, between humans and great apes. Well, when they did a comparison, they found out that between chimps and humans, it's only 25% similar. And between all the other ones, it's roughly around 25% similar. Our Y chromosome is not similar to great apes at all. So why would you think you had inheritable traits when only about 25% are common? Interesting. All right, so in summary, evolution affirmed, march of progress, depiction is an illusion, but it continues to be used for propaganda purposes. And human evolution hinges on similarities in skulls, in pelvis, in teeth, and genetics. But as we've seen, there's no basis for a solid claim from the skulls, neither from, we didn't cover the pelvis by very much, and genetics, as we saw, is no support whatsoever. In fact, it negates any idea we had a common ancestor with chimps. No objective or indisputable evidence of ape-to-human transition. It's all imaginary, illusory. It's all in the head. Okay? Humans have always been humans. Apes have always been apes. We know this to be the case because when humans reproduce, what did we get? Humans. In fact, during World War II, they tried to mate humans and apes. I'm not sure what the Nazis or the Russians, because they wanted to have a superhuman with the strength of gorillas, but being animals so they could be somewhat intelligent. It didn't work. One of the reasons is because chromosomes don't match. Humans have 46, apes have 48. It's not going to work. But they were thinking, because of evolutionary lines, well, if we evolve, maybe we're similar, we could boom. Awful stuff. Awful stuff. Yet there's much built-in variation, as we've seen. Experts admit the narrative for hominin origins, it's just a big mess. There's no consensus whatsoever, and Homo sapiens are distinct and unprecedented. We also said alleged ancestral skulls vary as much as skulls in existing humans. Homo Neanderthal, Erectus, and Homo flores and others are simply extinct humans. And it's interesting to quote, with each new find, researchers and news headlines announced that the fossils significantly altered our understanding of human evolution and dispersal from Africa. But if we have to rewrite the story of Homo sapiens evolution so frequently, we might ask whether the plot we're using is wrong to begin with. This is from Athrea S. And she was 2018. But we would say, yeah, you're on the wrong track. Humans did not evolve from an ape-like ancestor. Humans are special creations of God, in God's image, originally perfect and without sin, but fallen from that original state. We did not evolve from lower life forms. Humans have always been humans, and humans reproduce according to their kind. Although, right? Black and white, look at that. There's great diversity in the human race, but there's only one human race. These girls are twins. So what race are they? What race are they? They're just human. I can imagine these girls when they went to school, said, show up at school, nobody knows they're twins, and said, this is my sister. Come on, I like your sister. Well, it pretty much is. She's a twin. Okay? It might blow some people's mind, but yes, there's only one human race. Okay? The theory that humans evolved from ape-like ancestors is weaker than ever and should be debunked. Okay? And there's some resources, for example, contested bones are mentioned. 2 copies. Bone of contention is also good. I don't have it here, though. Genetic entropy, this is a resource. Of course, we don't have it here, but if you're interested in getting CMI resources, I'm going to come back in a month. I can get them and bring them here, but you have to pre-order them with me. Okay. This is Dr. John Sanford looking at the genetic entropy. Now, he was a professor at Cornell in genetics for 30 years. And he was saying that every generation we have more mutations, which means that you can only keep mutating so long before it gets too much, before the creature can't survive. And this is what genetic entropy is. We are not getting better. We cannot. We are getting worse. We did not go uphill. We are going downhill. And that makes sense. Adam and Eve would have had perfect genetic code. And the variation of every human would have been in their genetic makeup. They would have had no mutation. But of course, mutation would accumulate over time. And now we have, some 255,000 mutations today. Okay, another DVD, Ancient DNA. I know some of you, did anybody get a DVD when it came in? Okay, that's yours for free. How many have a DVD player? Yeah, so you can use it as a whatever you want with them. So I got plenty. Okay. Others, DVDs as well. Now, one of the things I mentioned is Creation Magazine. I think the ladies have the pages switched over. Do you have them? Or you do? No. Clipboard? Yeah, there are clipboards. Clipboards, yes, those are the clipboards. Okay, I'm just going to. You have them? Now would be the time. Okay, so, Pastor, could you hold up one of the Creation magazines? Unfortunately, I don't have a slide here. Creation Magazine. So we publish this magazine. It comes from Australia 4 times a year. 100% creation material. It comes out, you get a paper version. You also get links for our online version. And if you subscribe today, you get a free DVD and a magazine back issue. Okay, some of the DVDs are streamed as well, so you get a code so you can stream it online. All right, it's $9.50 every 3 months, so it's about $38 a year. And you can sign up with that clipboard. We won't pass it around. It'll be on the table at the back there if you're interested. Anybody get Creation Magazine here? Pastor, okay, a few of you. Great, thank you. We've also given you an envelope for contribution to CMI. We are a faith-based ministry, and we do have full-time staff. I'm not. I just get a small amount for every talk, but all the rest of it it's on my own. I'm retired, so I have my own pension, so it's not a problem. But we have to ship. In 2 weeks, I'm going to Alberta and Saskatchewan, which costs airfare, shipping materials, etc. Many times, these tours that we do, we can't make money on because we can't sell enough books to make up for it. So that's why we ask people, if you are willing to help Creation Magazine, you can either make a donation, 10, 20,000, be great, right? Small amounts would be fantastic. Or if you'd like to contribute monthly, you can do so using that envelope. You can give it to the lady who's handling the cash box there as well tonight. We'd appreciate that. Or you can go online and support the ministry. All right, that brings us to the fin of the talk. Right? Great. Thank you.
Donc, merci. Mais avant de partir, we're going to have some Q&A.
Okay.
Donc, on va, juste pour expliquer, on va prendre quelques questions. Si les questions sont trop longues, comme l'orateur revient dans un mois, il va pouvoir prendre le temps de développer. Donc, le 24 avril, donc le dernier vendredi du mois d'avril, on va avoir, toute la session sera seulement des questions-réponses. D'accord? On va vous afficher tout à l'heure, vous pourrez soumettre des questions d'avance qu'on lui enverra, comme ça, sur tous les sujets qui peuvent exister, pas seulement sur ce qui a été dit aujourd'hui, ça peut être sur la datation au carbone, ça peut être n'importe quelle question autour de l'évolution. On va se préparer en conséquence pour le faire.
You want to take a break for about 5 minutes?
Sure.
10 minutes?
You need a break?
I need a break. That's me.
Okay. I don't need a break.
Yeah. So you can avail yourself of resources. I have to change my slides as well. So that's
OK.
one of the reasons.
Donc, on va prendre quelques minutes de pause pour commencer à regarder le matériel. On va revenir pour des temps de questions-réponses.
Okay.
Ça vous va? Parfait. Soyez pas timide, s'il vous plaît.
Put this up in. Look. No, but if somebody wants it, well, we said we gave them they're not going to come up here. Yeah, but we go to show the box. After that, we go to read the back. If they want one question, the next time go ahead. Whenever you're ready. I'm ready. I have an updated presentation. Okay, we can go with but okay, you want to wait first for you to download? No. Okay, no, maybe 2 minutes. That remains about 5 minutes more. Fine when you're on vacation. Open the laptop. No, I open my computer, okay. I only use it for this operation. Fortunately, I think sign the paperwork before, I can tell you. It's great, big, rigorous. Yeah, I'm like a Mercedes. Hybrid. Now I'm looking for 30 kilometers autonomy, 35 in the summer. So my hybrid is it's not a single car. It's not a there's no reason sorry to go you're plug-in. Yes. It's just a hybrid. So it has a battery system. So sometimes the battery power
OK, on va recommencer. Questions-réponses. On a un temps de questions-réponses.
How long do you have? How long do you have? Yeah, for Q&A. As they want.
OK.
Testing. There you go. All right, we're about to do a Q&A.
Donc, pour ceux qui auront posé des questions, I have a mic. Just someone will give you the mic. You ask your question, whether it's in French or in English. If it's in French, I'm going to translate to English for him. If not, then...
That's you. I'm going to pass the mic to people.
You look good.
All right, so what I have done is I put some questions on this that you could, typical questions that come up, that if you see one you like, you can ask and I can have an answer for that. If you have other questions, that's fine too. There's also, you can, as again, I'm coming in a month's time, so you can, if I feel that the question needs more time, we'll leave it to the next one. Okay, so otherwise, I'll give you a short answer, but then could expand it on the next one. All right, any comments on the human evolution talk? Any? Too deep, too much, too little, too fast, too slow?
Yes, hi.
Yes, sir.
So I had thank you for your presentation, first of all. It was really interesting. So I had a question regarding what you talked about mitochondrial DNA dating. And you said that the new research using the pedigree method found that the mitochondrial Eve was 6,000 years ago. I just wanted to make sure, like, to understand better what's the difference between that method and the other ones that they used in the science, and which one is actually accurate. Which one should we use for research and... Yeah.
Okay, so what I understand, and I just was looking at this, and again, genetics is not my field, but from what I understand, that the mitochondrial DNA, I guess that's passed to the mother, okay, there are two ways of looking at this. One is what they call a phylogenetic tree. In other words, the perceived evolutionary progress over time. So basically what you do is you look at the number of mutations that are in the mitochondria. Okay. Oops, sorry, I clicked my button here. I'll put this. Anyway, we'll get that in a second. So, okay, all right. So they look at the number of mutations existing in the mitochondria, okay, and then they say, well, how long a time, since, Eve, mitochondria, humans came out of Africa. They're saying between 100 and 200,000 years ago, roughly 150,000 years. So they just simply do the division. So many mutations over that period of time, this is the rate of mutation. So that's how long they think it should be, because they're convinced that they did actually come out of Eve that long ago. However, that's what they call a phylogenetic trace. But when they actually did the pedigree, it actually looked at the rate of mutation. And of course, all those people who are doing ancestry, that's what they're looking for. What are all the changes and mutations in and so they can go back, but when they actually look at the actual DNA and mitochondrial DNA changes, it's a lot faster by order of magnitude than what it should be, but that should be is just based on the theory of evolution. So you have actual observed data compared to theoretical data. Now, which one do you want? Any scientist should say, well, I'm going to go with the observed data. This is what science is supposed to do. I don't make up stories. I look at the data and base my theories on actual data, not on what I want it to say, because then you're not objective. Sure. Anyone else? La madame à côté de vous.
In this case, does the method of is the previous method that we used before to date those bone became inaccurate for every single situation, for every single use it has before?
Dating method, you mean? The dating?
For the date of the bone that we found, you said.
Yeah. So one of the big issues is, and we didn't tackle this on this talk, was dating. How old were these bones? Okay, so you're probably very familiar or heard of radiometric dating. Carbon-14, uridium lead, potassium argon, all of these radioisotope or radiometric dating method. This is one of those questions that you have a short answer and a very long answer. Okay, so I'm going to give you a short answer now, and if you would like, we can cover that in depth, because this is probably, and old agers, they camp on that this is indisputable. You can't argue with that. Okay. However, creationists do dispute that because for various reasons. Okay, and it has to do with radiometric dating, of which carbon-14 is. It has to do with a natural decay of radioactive material. So, for example, carbon-14 is a radioactive variant or isotope of carbon, which is carbon-12. Okay, I keep touching my keyboard. All right. Anyway, I don't know if there was this. So, radiometric version. So, now what happens is that the carbon-14 is slowly over a period of time. Actually, it's a relatively recent rate of 5,730 years. It will reduce the amount it has in half, what they call the half-life. So if I have 100,000 atoms of carbon-14 over 5,730 years, I'm going to have half of that. Okay, and then over another 5,730 years, a half of that, and then a half of that, half of that. So what they call it, this is the exponential decay rate. So it goes a half, a quarter, an eighth, a 16th, 256. Anyway, you get exponential. So basically, in general, after about 10 half-lives, there should be none left. 10 half-lives. That's just high level, okay? And so what they do is when they have carbon-14, now they never date these fossils with carbon-14 for a reason. I'll get into it in a minute, right? So for carbon-14, what they'll do is they'll say, how much carbon-14 do we have in the sample? I have an example here of a piece of amber with an insect in it. Okay, how old is this? Half a million years. Well, I picked it up in Tallinn, Estonia. And I went to the guy, and it was on his shelf, and I asked the guy, well, how old is this? He says 60 million years. I said, how do you know? Well, that's what's written on the card with it. Interestingly enough, and this, of course, Jurassic Park has a lot to do with that. Have you watched that movie? This has something to do with that mosquito that was in a... Anyway, long story. Well, 4 movies in which you're doing things you shouldn't, but anyway, that's something else. But you can actually take amber, melt it, put an insect in it, and say, voila, 50 million years old. Nobody can tell. The experts can't tell. But coming back to carbon-14. So if I take some organic material that I think is under 60,000 years, I will take a sample, right, small sample. I will send it to a lab like Beta Analytics. They will take that sample, they will crush it, Then they will put it in this fancy dancy machine, which has all the, and out will come to the accelerated mass spectrometry, AMS, and it counts the atoms, carbon-14 atoms that come out of it. And in the order of 2 hours, you have 10,000 carbon-14 atoms. All right, so what do they do then? They do a calculation. And they come up with a date. So all you have is 2 hours, you have a bunch of data, and you're going to then claim that this proves this thing is that old. But how do you know this? How do you know how old that thing is? What do you calibrate it against? You have to have something in which to calibrate it. Right? So how do you know your measuring instrument is measuring anything? I got a tire changed at the garage. Now, I've been changing tires since I was 15 years old. I'm not that young anymore. So I looked at the tire. It was my wife's car. All 3 tires were great, except one tire was low because it was bulging out. It's low. I called the guy. I went to test it with my little gauge. Yeah, it's low, 20 some odd pounds. Ooh, that's too low. But it just came from the garage. So I called up the mechanic and says, hey, you're sending out your cars with tire pressure too low. No. We have 2 digital machines that measure the pressure, etc. I said, I don't care what your machines say. It's actually low. Look, I didn't follow up on it. I filled it myself. But so how do we know who's right? Because you have to have something to calibrate it with. Now with carbon-14, you have things you can calibrate it with, things of known age. So for example, now this is the short version, right? Archaeological objects, okay? So they find some, let's say in Jericho, in Israel, they find some grain. They can then say, okay, well, we know the age when this was, according to archaeological historical account. We know how old this thing is, right? We know how old this thing is, and so we can then calibrate our carbon-14 against things of known age. And that works pretty well. Things like the Shroud of Turin, apparently the shroud that Jesus wore when he was resurrected, and it has, people claim it's a resurrection shroud, so they used carbon-14. Initially, when it came out, it was like only 1,200 years ago. Now there's some changes with that. So they have some things like tree ring, dendrochronology, dating, etc. But so carbon-14 works up to a certain point, thousands of years. But now when you're talking millions of years, and how do they calibrate things millions of years? What do we know is millions of years old? We don't know any of it is millions of years old. We just assume it. And where did the assumption come from? The rock layers. The sedimentary layers. If you were to go to the Grand Canyon and you look down, I've been there several times, you look at all this flat rock strata, they're saying that took 2 billion years to accumulate. So if I go down to the bottom layer and I find something there, how old is it supposed to be? Well, about 2 billion years old, right? If I go partly up, it's younger, and all the way to the top, actually the top's about 170 million years. But anyway, so what they're using is they don't actually, and never actually did date by radiometric dating. They did it by the rock strata. So it's already, long before radiometric dating came on the scene, they had estimated the ages for the rocks. Anything found in those rocks, they assign it, they date it according to the rock layer it's in. So if I find a layer that's 200 million years old, anything in the rock layer that's in there is 200 million years old. Okay? But that's based on the assumptions that these rock layers actually are created over the millions and billions of years, which I do not agree with. That's what I'm studying right now. I haven't finished it though, is looking at university geology text. And all I'm hearing is a lot of noise, a lot of talk about this and that, and this happened so many million years ago. I'm still waiting for proof. What do you have to prove what it is? Right? Who actually saw this? Nobody saw any of this stuff. It's stories that are made up. Some of it's made correct. I mean, you have rocks and granites, etc. But these layers? Nah, not buying it. Anyway, so that's the quick, and part of the thing with carbon-14, is we find carbon. Now, if you have something with carbon-14, it cannot be older than 100,000 years. That's the absolute maximum. Anything over that should be carbon-14 dead. Except we find diamonds, which are allegedly billions of years old, with carbon-14. We find dinosaur bones with carbon-14. So what do the evolutionists say? Dinosaur bones? Contamination. It's contamination. It's not really. It's not young. It can't be young. We've already determined. We have our conclusion. So whatever evidence you bring, if it fits, we like it. If it doesn't, we kick it out. Okay, so that was there's more. If you want, I can go into more depth. That is probably the number one argument people use for the deep time is radiometric dating. And I say this, one of the things when I started, actually this is one of the things I first started looking at when I became a Christian and started interested in this. I went to the company library at Canadair on Marcel Lorrain, which is now Bombardier, looked at the Van Nostrum Scientific Encyclopedia, tell me about radiometric dating, and they listed all the assumptions involved in these methods. And there are many assumptions involved. People say there aren't any, but there are many. Okay, I'll leave that one there. We've beaten that one up. So.
There's a question online.
Sorry, yeah, well, I must have changed that. You want to bring that one up there? On this. What says God created Adam and Eve, and the science tells that man evolved through time from Homo habilis to modern humans. Do you think there's a link between Adam and the first human from the science theory? Pretty much the entire talk I just gave was on this topic here. So the answer is no. No, there's no Adam, no. It's Adam who had Eve and it descended from over 6,000 years. Nothing, no connection to. The only connection maybe is that Adam was actually Homo erectus. Dr. Ross Marcus said this to me at the International Conference on Creationism last 2 years ago. This was his idea. He's not firm on it, but he suggests that might be an idea. But I think we actually addressed this question. Okay, anything else? Oh, let me put up those other questions that I had here.
D'autres questions dans la salle?
Est-ce qu'il y a une autre question pour moi? Madame.
Je peux parler en français?
Ok, il va traduire pour moi.
Ok, merci beaucoup pour la conférence. En fait, on a acheté ce DVD, c'est écrit Ancient DNA, mais on veut savoir en fait ça parle de quoi? En résumé. Je sais que c'est en anglais, mais...
What is it about? So, I believe it's by Dr. Robert Carter. Dr. Robert Carter, yeah, he's one of our speakers. He loves genetics. So he looks at the ancient DNA from like Neanderthal, Denisovans, Erectus, all that we have DNA from, and addresses it, how it compares to Homo sapiens, us today, and showing that actually, yes, DNA there are changes over time, but we're still human, okay? So he looks at what they call ancient, not evolutionary, but old DNA. For example, there's a group of people called the Denisovans or the Denisovians, which are claimed to be ancestors, but we know that they have Denisovans and Neanderthal and humans all have shared DNA. So they're all. So he goes into it in depth. Now, malheureusement, c'est seulement en anglais that DVD, right? So, but so that's what he's going into in that DVD. Okay, correct? Ça va? Okay. Oh, yeah, he wants the microphone.
Moi, j'avais juste une question simple. My question is about Big Bang Theory and theory of dinosaurs. I want to know what you think about that.
Dinosaurs? Les dinosaures? Okay, I love them. J'aime les dinosaures. I actually, the last time, 2023, I gave a talk on dinosaurs. I don't know if you remember. So I will say for many people, the problem with dinosaurs is propaganda, is programmation, brainwashing. Because every time, and you watch for this, every time you hear about a dinosaur find, what do you also get? Millions of years. It's a stamp. Here's a dinosaur, Dimetrodon, 250 million years. Tyrannosaurus rex, 75 million years. So we're always associating dinosaurs and deep time. Dinosaurs, deep time. We're programmed. So, and it's a very effective propaganda tool. But we don't have a problem with dinosaurs. Dinosaurs were created on day 6. They got to be very big. Some of them were, there aren't that many varieties of dinosaurs. There are only about 75 kinds of dinosaurs. And they would have lived the same time of humans. Most of them would have died out during the flood. But some of them could have survived, were taken on board the ark and survived after that. But environment changed, so most of them would have died out. Although there is evidence that dinosaurs lived up until recently. Even in the Congo, there's Oti Benga, I think it is, one of those, you don't have the name right, but there are rumors of a dinosaur roaming there. Probably not. Our view is that all dinosaurs are dead for one good reason. In order to keep a species alive, you have to have not just 2, you have to have at least 1,000 creatures of the same kind. It's what they call a minimum viable population. If you do not have enough of the same kind of creatures, they're not going to survive. That's why you have problem with island populations, right? Homo floresiensis, they're what they call, forget there's a term there, but it's if you're isolated on an island and you interbreed with those same people continuously, the mutation goes up and up and up and up, and eventually it dies off. Right? So, for example, even if they were to get woolly mammoth, somehow create woolly mammoth, it's finished. Anyway, because you don't have enough diversity. You have to have at least 1,000 woolly mammoths in order to keep going. Okay, so that's the problem with genetics. All right, so we don't have a problem with dinosaurs. They lived. Do you have a particular question, or? We love dinosaurs. I have 4 sons. They all played with dinosaurs. Usually the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Anyway, so.
Maybe if I may add something, maybe to add. Une des choses qui, pour nous en tant que chrétiens, qui est difficile, c'est parce que la Bible ne parle pas directement de dinosaures. Ça fait qu'au départ, lorsque la notion de dinosaure est sortie, le monde religieux a commencé par dire non, avant de se rendre compte que oui, il y a des dinosaures, même autant de... c'est que juste la Bible ne nomme pas tous les animaux. C'est ça qui est un peu difficile. There was a book that I bought here, actually, of Dragons of Dinosaurs. I don't know if you know that book.
I read it, yeah.
Donc, s'il est là, c'est un livre qui est intéressant parce qu'il montre comment, des fois dans la Bible, le mot dragon, vous savez, quand dans l'Ancien Testament on parle du mot dragon, il a fait une étude qui dit que probablement c'était l'équivalent du mot dinosaure parce que le mot dinosaure n'existe pas avant le 19e ou le 20e siècle. Donc, il y avait d'autres manières de les nommer. C'est juste que le mot dinosaure ne peut pas être trouvé dans la Bible. Je ne sais pas si ça aide un peu à la question. Donc,
il y a un DVD en français sur Dinosaur, qui c'est gratuit. C'est un brun. Do you have that? As-tu, toi aussi? OK. Je pense qu'il y a une autre. Il y a dans la boîte en arrière, là? Non? OK. OK. So.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, my question is that in the histories, they teach us that we have different ice age through the histories. And if it's the Earth is just 6,000 years, is it possible that we have also the ice age they talk about?
Good question. A bonne question. Okay, Ice Age. So many years ago, when I was young, there was only one ice age. Then they started saying there's 15 ice ages. Okay, so was there an ice age? We believe there was one ice age. And in order to have an ice age, you need a lot of ice, correct? Where's the ice coming from? You need a lot of ice coming from snow, right? Okay, it doesn't rain in the North and South Pole, it's snow. Well, in order to get that much snow in the North and South Pole, where are you going to get the humidity? Well, from the ocean, which means you have to heat up the ocean. You know, élever la température dans the mer. Okay? So how could you do that? Well, one of the ways you do that is you fracture the crust of the earth. Okay? You make all these cracks in the earth. Okay? In fact, around the earth there is part of the mid-Atlantic ridge, a crack, part of the tectonic plates, 25,000 miles around the entire earth. This is where there had been cracks. And what do those cracks allow? Lava, magma, and an awful lot of heat. So the model for creationists have is what they call the catastrophic plate tectonics. The idea that we're not sure whether the flood started the plate tectonics or the plate tectonics started the flood, but we believe that during the flood event, that talks about the fountains of the deep breaking up, the crustal plates breaking up. So that would have then allowed a lot of crustal movement, the movement of the plates. And as you may know, if you move the plates underwater, what happens? What do you say? Tsunamis, yes. In Japan, Southeast Asia, very small displacement, lots of water, massive water. So if you have massive plate shifts, you're going to move a lot of water, have a lot of flooding, which would come over the continent, okay, and wash everything out, wipe it away, creating all the sedimentary layers. But the very breaking up of the crust puts a lot of heat into the water, which caused the ocean, which caused a lot of humidity, massive amounts of rain, and of course it talks about rain on the North and South Pole, which comes down in snow, year after year after year, something like 500 years, and that snow just accumulates and starts going down the poles, down past here, down into the United States, but then, you know, the crusts are healed now, they're no longer putting out the heat dissipates, and then the ice starts to go back up. And so perhaps the loss of ice in the Antarctic and the Arctic is a result of that. That's what we're seeing today, not necessarily global warming. You follow so far? That make sense? So yes, we believe the Ice Age is an effect, a result of a worldwide catastrophe, the global flood. One of the questions remains is, what started all of this? Okay, was it an asteroid impact? Like, you know, they say the one that destroyed all the dinosaurs? Well, possibly. One of the things that catastrophic plate tectonics has actually been modeled in supercomputers by Dr. Baumgartner, John Baumgartner, who was a theoretical physicist at the Los Alamos labs, you know, the big nuclear bomb one, and he used supercomputers to model this. And it has been presented several times at International Conference on Creationism, and it seems to be a fairly workable model, explaining convection currents, etc., and movements of plates, etc. It's a whole nother thing, right? But that should explain it. But yes, one ice age as a result of the flood, and so, but you got to remember that the ice age didn't affect most of the Earth. right? It didn't affect around the equator because the ice didn't come down that far. So it wouldn't have affected South America, Africa, Asia, only northern Canada and Russia and Europe. That's it. Okay? A lot of people think Ice Age had covered the whole planet. No, couldn't have. No. Bonne question. Merci. Une autre question?
Thank you for the conference. I have a question. When I was primarily in Africa, I was told that Africa is the cradle of humanity. Is it true? And if it is, how can we explain the different color of skin around the world?
Okay, so in evolutionary theory, there are a number of them. There's out of Africa. There's out of Africa modified. And there's something, we didn't come from out of Africa. We came from the Middle East area. It all depends on what they think was the gene flow, right? The gene flow over time, okay? So, no, we didn't come out of Africa, although, sorry. So, we came out of course, humans would have come out of the area where the ark was, right? We're all descended from those who got out of Noah's ark, correct? So there's three couples, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, so we're all descended. They went into different regions of the world. I don't have a map here, but different regions of the world. And so one of the things is, as you recall, the Tower of Babel, Tower of Babel. This is probably in the Iraq, Iran area. People, God had commanded Adam and Eve, subdue the earth, multiply and cover the earth. Didn't happen, right? So then God said again, after the flood, Noah and your family, multiply and go over the earth. Except people said, no, we don't like that idea. So we're going to stay together, we're going to build this tower, etc. So God said, yeah, you're not going to do that. You're going to go and they're going to separate all of you. So what we're going to do is confuse your language. So what happens with that? So nobody could speak to each other, so certain families would go and they different parts of the world. So that would explain, for example, different language groups. So the Chinese language, and of course its characters, is totally different than Arabic, which uses strokes and lines like that, which is totally different than English, with the Latin languages. They have no connection with each other. You cannot connect them together. That's indicating the separate origin. So people would adopt different ways of speaking. Now you have to remember that humans were smart back then. Right? Humans have devolved in intelligence. Adam and Eve would have been the smartest people ever lived. And it goes down and gets less. All right, so they would have come up with languages. Now what about skin color? Okay. I know it's of interest to a lot of people, skin color. But as we saw here, those girls, they're twins. So everybody has different. So it depends on genes and recessive genes, and also whom you marry, whom you have children with, right? So us white people, if my wife is white, guess what our kids are going to be? They're white-skinned, okay? Now I have blue eyes, my wife has brown eyes. So guess what color eyes the kids have? Brown eyes, right? But that's the way genetics works, okay? Now, if I was to marry someone with black skin, what would our children come out as? Anywhere between black, brown, and white. Okay? Because it's in the genes, there's two types, it comes out to melanin, right? Which gives your skin color. There's two types. There's the black-white, there's the yellow-red. So depending on which have the ratio, so of course people of Oriental or would have different skin colors, people of indigenous. It all depends on the ratio you have, and it depends on where it comes from your parents and whether, for example, black people who marry black people have kids with black people, the kids are going to be black, predominantly. And Chinese people will have Chinese kids and have Chinese kids, and they'll all have black hair, okay? But as soon as you start mixing, right, then you get all different colors and shades, etc. So it all depends on how you group and that together. So it's all in genetic code. A lot of people focus on skin color because of racism, right? Because of this is a way of discriminating against people. you can tell people by, skin color. But it depends on where you come from, I guess, or your background for that. But people have different heights. Those pygmies, people in Africa, they're very short people. And they marry short people, and their kids are short. And some people are very tall, and their kids are tall. But if they intermarry short and tall, my wife is 5 something, and our kids are somewhere between. It's all a mixing. But it's all one human race, and it's all in the mixing of the genetic code. Okay? Even scientists will say there is no biological basis for race. There is no basis for race. It's a social construct, if you like. Right? How can I discriminate against groups of people? Right? Not me. Une autre question? Yes, my dear.
J'ai une question. Ma question, on revient sur les dinosaures.
Again? Ok, les dinosaures.
Yeah.
Tu aimes les dinosaures? Ok.
Puis ma question c'est, est-ce que genre les dinosaures, quand on dit, les scientifiques disent que quand ils ont disparu à cause genre d'une météorite et tout, mais on lit aussi dans la Bible que genre le diable il est descendu, et genre j'ai regardé un truc pour dire genre peut-être la météorite qui est tombée sur les dinosaures, c'était peut-être le Satan.
You're going to have to translate
So
for it.
she says that as we know that what they say, the dinosaur was destroyed by a meteorite that hitting the earth, and the Bible said that the devil came down. So maybe there are some theories that says the devil was the meteorite. That's it.
No.
Change your readings.
No.
What
There was a theory. So the idea was in the gap theory. The gap theory is the idea of, so when Darwin and deep time were first starting to become popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s, it created a problem for people who believed the Bible. They were told that long periods of time, there were dinosaurs millions of years ago. Okay? How do I fit that in the Bible? Because when I read the Bible, it says in the beginning God created, and then day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's no millions of years. There's only 6 days and then 6,000 years. So how do I fit it? So the idea was between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, in the white space, this is where you put all the millions of years of evolution. So what happened was that there was an original creation millions of years ago, and the dinosaurs and evolution, all that stuff. But then Satan fell, the earth was destroyed, along with all the dinosaurs, except blah, blah, blah. And then, Genesis 1:2, and the earth was formless and void. That means it was empty. That's because it had been all destroyed. And now God starts again creating the light, and then the sun, and then the moon, and the planets, and all that stuff. So that's what they call the gap theory. That's where they fit it all. And so the idea was Satan's fall from heaven destroyed the earth during that time period, killed all the dinosaurs, etc. That's old. The problem was because they tried to keep millions of years and fit it in the Bible. You cannot do that. It doesn't work. And one of the reasons is you will have death before Adam, right? If you have dinosaurs millions of years ago and ape-like humans millions of years ago, then they were long before Adam. And therefore, Adam didn't bring death into the world. It had been there all along, you see? And therefore, Adam, as we talked about at the beginning, if you don't have a real Adam, you don't have a gospel. Okay? Does that answer your question? Okay?
Just sur ce point, je rappelle ceux qui viennent à l'église, on a dit dans 2 ou 3 dimanches, je vais justement enseigner sur comment on interprète Genèse 1 à 3, quelles sont toutes les théories qui existent et comment est-ce que ça marche. Donc, on aura un enseignement de tout un culte là-dessus. Donc, vous pourrez toujours poser des questions, mais on va amener ces points, comme je dis, dans probablement le dimanche après Pâques ou celui après, dépendamment du calendrier. On va répondre à ces questions. Alors, on fera des questions-réponses aussi là-dessus. Là, le temps avance. On va prendre, il va nous rester... Qui sait qu'il y a des questions qu'on va garder 2-3 questions? Parce que, OK, on a 3 personnes et puis c'est bon. Est-ce qu'on est d'accord?
Au revoir, madame.
Tu peux poser des questions, mais il faut qu'on le sache maintenant. Ceux qui ont des questions, qu'on le sache, OK? Parce que le temps avance. C'était une longue semaine. Et comme on l'a dit tout à l'heure, on pourra poser des questions. Dans un mois, ce sera juste une séance de questions-réponses. Vous pouvez envoyer vos questions d'avance. L'orateur se prépare.
Yeah, if you have a question that we don't have time for tonight, you can let Pastor know, and he'll let me know, and then I'll do enough research to give a good answer the next time.
Exactly.
Okay? Some of these are long, okay? We don't have time. So, leave it up. Yes?
My question is, do you agree with the idea that the continents, they were once all together
Yes.
before they... Yeah,
Yes.
you agree with
Plate tectonic. Yes.
Okay.
So the idea that she's referring to, that all the continents were one. Yes. If you look at the elbow of Africa, South America, you know, the Brazil, and the armpit of Africa, yeah, they and fit. Yeah. In fact, there are dinosaur footprints from Brazil which continue on in Africa, which indicates that at one time they were. Now, the big question is, how did they separate? Well, you've been told continental drift, right? Slow. If you look at today, the continents are moving very slowly, like 7 millimeters, maybe a year, very slowly. Okay? So, if it has been doing that all along, then it's going to take millions of years to separate. But nobody saw that, right? But if you had a global catastrophe, you started out with, remember, God said He put all the water to one place. Recall in the creation week? So that means all the land would have been in one area. Now, then, so everything's together. Now, would have caused some geological activity. Something would have happened in the Earth structure. And then if you have some kind of event which broke up the continental plates, then, of course, then the plates are going to move away from each other. You know, I actually have a little video here, if I can play it here. Hang on, let me just a second here. Yeah.
Don't forget we don't have the sound. If you need sound for the video, we won't be able to hear it.
Hang on, I just got to find this here a second. Let me go back here. There we are. Okay, so this is just a little video. I put it together from various sources. So this is on land and the plates are breaking up. Okay. The fountains of the earth crust deep or break up. Earthquake, ruptures, faults and volcanoes occur. Lava and superheated water escapes. Okay. Of course, this is on land. You're going to also see that in the ocean. And then you have this. This is convection. This is actually believed to be what scientists now a lot slower. And so, of course, you see this happening and the plates are separating. Lava comes up, it goes sideways, but some of it is going to be subducted. It's going to go down the plate continent. And you can see underground, actually they can see globs of cool rock. Okay, watch what happens as the continent moves. You'll notice it's going to spring back all of a sudden. Here. Wait, boom, see that? So that causes tsunamis to go up on the land and builds up and comes up on the continent. And you can see here, it's actually a video of the tsunami from Japan. Okay. This is a small tsunami, even though it's massive. Here you can see again, now this is set in where the continent's already split, but you can imagine that this would split the continents up very, very rapidly. Because on the lithosphere, it's sort of a slippery. Okay, the continents are actually on slippery rock, somewhere between plasmic, and they would have moved around very, very quickly into the present position. So we do believe that there was one time one continent Gondwana, Rodina, Pangea, whatever you want, and then that split up as a result of the plate tectonic or forces during the flood event. So yes, that's part of the catastrophic plate tectonic model. Okay?
Maurice?
That answer your question? Let me ask you this question. Mount Everest. You're not going to get a tsunami to get 29,000 feet up, are you? That's like 13,000 meters. You're not going to get water to go that high. Are you? No. There's not enough water to get that high. So how do you explain that? I have an encyclopedia of the Bible at home, and the article on the flood, the guy says, throughout history, people believed the flood was global, covered all the earth. He didn't think so. This is the guy writing in a Bible encyclopedia. He didn't think it was a global flood. He said, no, one reason, there isn't enough water to cover Mount Everest. Well, that's true. That's true, there's not enough water. You'd have to have 7 or 8 times the amount of water on the earth today to cover Mount Everest. Okay, so how do you solve that problem? What are the assumptions? If I can give you any kind of tip, ask yourself what is being assumed? What is taken for granted? What is believed the situation was? This applies to everything. What is assumed? The assumption is Mount Everest was there before the flood happened. But maybe Mount Everest came after the flood happened. So when those plates started colliding, some would subduct and others would buckle up. This is what actually is believed that happened in the Himalayas. The Asian and the Indian continent plates came together and they went up like this. As a matter of fact, it's still rising. Mount Everest is still rising. Okay? And so when you think about it, as a result of the flood, the continents break up, these pieces start moving around the earth, they slam into each other, and they come like this. So what would I expect to find to justify that? Right? So if there were all these fish in the water, were buried, fossilized immediately, and clams and everything that's on the bottom of the ocean would be there. And then as the mountain rises up, it carries those fossils up to 29,000 feet. And that's exactly what we find. Within 200 feet of the top of Mount Everest are fossils, marine fossils from the ocean. Some people say, oh, no, this happened very, very, very slowly. Very, very, very slowly, very slowly, very slowly. Well, you have two things going together very slowly. They're most likely to grind each other to gravel, right? But doing like this fast, it goes up fast. That's an explanation, okay, of how it is. All right, so ask a question.
Maurice?
Oui, monsieur.
Yes, so my question is a little bit outside of the scope of your presentation, but I was wondering, so many people claim that, like in the Quran, it contains scientific knowledge ahead of its time. So how do you as a Christian evaluate these claims, and how do you distinguish between genuine insight and retrospective interpretation, especially when similar claims are sometimes made about the Bible?
Yeah, so I've read the Quran, and I'm familiar with the claim of scientific miracles. Okay. So the claims are often overstated. The text does not actually refer to what is being claimed. There was a book by a guy named Bucaille, B-U-C-A-I-L-L-E, who came out with a book thick of embryology, for example. That how would Muhammad know about the development of the baby in the womb? I mean, this is long before modern science. Well, the description in the Quran about reproduction, and the specific verses says that sperm comes from the backbone. Okay, anybody believe that's true? No. Okay, and that the bones for first and then the flesh. Well, actually, they're not the same. There's actually videos on YouTube debunking those claims. Okay, so the Quranic came about scientific miracles? No. They're just... Now, the problem is that if you're a Muslim, and you hear all this criticism of Islam and this and that, it's violent, and Muhammad had sex with a 9-year-old girl, and all these type of things, you are going to try to find anything that supports your faith. Especially when you are told that if you leave, you could be killed. Right? So there's even more reason to want to find reasons to stay. So when somebody says there's scientific miracles in the Quran, you're going to accept those even if they aren't really scientific claims in the Quran. Okay? Now, about the Bible. So a lot of people said the Bible is not a book of science. Okay? If people said that. But that is irrelevant. That is not a relevant question. Because when we understand what science is man's effort to understand how the natural world works. Science actually started from Christians. It was a Christian view. The idea that God had put order and design in the universe, and if that was the case, we should be able to find it in the universe. If you didn't think it existed, you would not be looking for it. But as we have discovered, there is so much design, purpose, mathematical, my son is a PhD in math, okay? He would say that's the chief of the sciences. Everything is mathematically formulated. Physics is all mathematics. That's what he's teaching. Teaching physics or math to engineering students. If you need to know the math in order to do the engineering. Okay? Chemistry, you need to know the math. You need to know the function. Everything is chemistry. All works by physics and laws, etc. So that's where science comes from. But it is man's effort to understand how the natural world works. So it cannot even address anything supernatural. There's a different realm. So when guys like Neil deGrasse Tyson, a very well-known astrophysicist in the United States, starts talking about God, that's merely his opinion. It's nothing to do with science. It's not, right? Now the question is, where does God fit in with science? Well, the answer is, God is who made the entire universe to begin with. He was the one that put order and design and meaning into it. Okay? We're then trying to figure out what he did. What evolutionists try to say is, we can explain how order and design came into the universe from no order, no design, no purpose. No reason at all. So how do you do that? You have no reason to believe anything, or even that your brain is working. So does that answer your question? Okay. There's a longer answer, but at some point I have to go home, so do you.
Okay. Last dernière question.
Thank you. My name is Peter.
Hi, Peter. My dad's name was Peter.
I'm sorry?
My father's name was Peter.
Yeah, and there was the one apostle.
Yes, okay, but we don't have to go that far back. But
All right. I believe on one of the topics I saw the point number 24, which tells us, is that no? 28.
28.
Population growth. I seen something on YouTube once that they say there was the latest discovery based on the mutation rate, which points us back in time. Is that true or
no?
Can you?
No. So just see if I. Hang on. Let me just skip here a second because I have to find a slide. Okay. Yeah, I had when I was on my vacation, my laptop crashed. The hard drive crashed and all the files on it, so I didn't notice that. Oh, now it's doing an update. All right, great. All right, so here is a chart from the World Population Reference Bureau, I think it is, One World in Data, and it's talking about world population, okay? So this is from allegedly 10,000 years ago to today. Roughly we have about 8 billion people on the earth today. Right. Now, one of the things that's noticed here is that I have actually a time. Anyway, we'll do it here. So, as you'll notice, in the last part of it here, within the last several hundred years, the population has gone skyrocketed. This is the nature of exponential growth. When you double, when you start doubling a billion, what would you get? 2 billion and 4 billion and 8 billion? Well, that's what's been happening the last 2 years. Okay? Now, this data, the last couple thousand years, we have pretty good, roughly, population numbers. Before that, we don't, because nobody was counting people. Okay, nobody knew how the people in the world were. I mean, Columbus only found out there was a new world in 1492. So, anyway, so notice, I want you to notice something on this chart. Okay, now, first of all, think about this. If this chart is correct, in 10,000 years, we have 8 billion people. If humans have been around for 1 million years, then the number of people that we hear today would be like, how many, 100 times this? It would be overpopulated. Now, it's not an exponential growth formula, it's a logistic growth formula. Okay, there's a population capacity. We have not reached the population capacity of the Earth yet. Somewhere around 50 billion, 100 billion. Okay, so we haven't reached the population. And yet, but let's look at this chart here a bit, which I found telling. Okay, the world population annual growth decreased from 2% in 1955 to 0.9% in 2022. It's expected to decrease to 0.1% in 2077. So population go down. In fact, in Japan has lost about 5 million people in its population in the last 7 to 10 years. They're not having kids, they don't have immigration. In fact, they're incentivizing, if you're single, you're going to be taxed extra. Because they want to, it's going to be a real problem when the old people are going to be, just going to be all us old people and all the young people. Who's going to look after us? Anyway, so notice this. Between 10,000 and 6,000 BC, they're saying the population growth was only, how much? 0.04%. 0.04%. And yet today, it's at 0.9%. The reason they did that is to stretch out the time. They had to stretch out the time. Because if the population growth had been, and when you think about it, why would people have been limiting the population? If there's nobody on the earth, why would you, and there's no birth control, right? And there is high mortality, of course. But, many times if there's high mortality, you have lots of kids. You're going to have lots of kids, no birth control. I mean, typically in Quebec, having 19, 20 kids in a family was not unheard of. I come from a family of 7 kids. My aunt and uncle had 10 kids. Okay? My sons have 2 and 3. So, anyway, population go down. But, so, if there's no reason actually to limit population, we don't have the overpopulation problem, then why are they putting it down to 0.04%? And yet, later on here, you see, right, if it had been, if the population, I don't know what I'm reading here. Anyway, the number would be, just imagine. Notice that from 2,500 to the present, they have population growing at 0.4%, or 10 times faster. Okay? Again, nobody counted these. Nobody knew the population back then, but in order to stretch out the timeline, make it longer, you have to go at a very, very slow rate. It doesn't make any sense. Now, if you have people after the flood, you can easily get, in 4,500 years, 8 billion people from 2. Not a problem at all. So we can, from Noah, 4.5 billion people, not a problem. We still have plenty of room to grow. Okay, does that answer your question? Okay.
Okay.
Then I'm done.
Can we... Donc, ce qu'on va faire, comme le temps avance, c'est une offrande volontaire. Vous pouvez mettre ce que vous voulez ici dedans. Et il y aura aussi du matériel qui va être disponible à l'arrière. Donc, il y a des personnes qui vous serviront. Je rappelle, on se retrouve dans un mois, le 24 24 avril, c'est ça? C'est ça, hein? Le 24 avril, dernier vendredi du mois d'avril. Peux-tu afficher encore, s'il te plaît, le courriel de l'Église? Si vous avez des questions comme aujourd'hui, que vous voulez poser des questions d'avance, écrivez-nous. On va transférer ces questions à l'orateur. Comme ça, il arrivera avec d'autres questions encore, des réponses déjà prêtes, et après, on prendra évidemment d'autres questions de la foule. Oui? Oui, on peut donner électroniquement. Il faut juste pouvoir, par Interact, il faut juste pouvoir...
If you would like to make a donation to CMI, you can do it on our mission.
Exactement. Ceux qui veulent le faire, c'est soit vous allez sur le site de l'Église, vous spécifiez Creation Ministry, vous allez directement sur le site de CMI et vous faites votre don à cet endroit-là. Donc, encore une fois, chacun de vous est libre de le faire. Nous, évidemment, en tant qu'Église, on s'occupe aussi de bénir ce ministère-là. Est-ce qu'on peut prier? Et après ça, on va aller dans la prochaine phase. Seigneur, nous te bénissons, nous te rendons grâce. Merci pour ce temps. On a parlé du mystère de ta création, de comment est-ce qu'on veut le comprendre. Je prie que tu nous aides, que tu ouvres notre esprit, que tu nous aides à comprendre encore, Père éternel. Je sais que ça paraît très scientifique, beaucoup de gros mots d'une certaine manière, mais ce sont ces choses-là qu'on enseigne à l'école et on doit apprendre à défendre notre foi. Seigneur, je te bénis. Et que ceci serve à ancrer notre foi. Peut-être il y en a parmi nous, en ligne ou ici, qui hésitent, qui se posent beaucoup de questions par rapport à ce qu'ils entendent, que ce type de conférence les amène à être convaincus que leur foi n'est pas un coup d'épée dans l'eau, Seigneur. Je te bénis, Seigneur, que ton Esprit Saint travaille. Merci pour Gus, merci pour Creation Ministry, que tu bénisses. Merci pour tout ce qu'ils font dans cette sphère de la foi, Seigneur. Et nous te disons encore, jusqu'à ce qu'on se voit dans un mois pour la suite de cette conférence, sois béni et sois glorifié dans le nom de Jésus. Amen. Amen. Soyez bénis.
One last thing, if you could pray for Creation Ministries, we'd greatly appreciate it. Money's great, but we have many of the staff have serious issues, including, some of the things can't get into, but we would appreciate prayer for our ministry, for not only the guys speakers, but the staff in Ontario who arrange all of this stuff for us. We greatly appreciate that. Thank you.